Good evening, everybody. Well, it is fantastic to be here with you this evening. You might have heard already, my name is James Hewitt, and I am a human performance scientist. You know, I'm fascinated by the intersection of four different topics: leadership, well-being, peak performance, and the future of work. I was so intrigued by these topics, in fact, I decided to do a PhD in the middle too, the relationship between well-being and performance in the workplace. But you know, there's a challenge for many of us, because well-being and performance, rather than feeling like they're complementary, all too often for many of us, it feels like they're in conflict. I'm sure that many of you might relate to some of these statistics. You know, for too many people, rather than well-being and performance feeling complementary, it feels like they're working harder and faster than ever before. You know, there's some great data that we can capture from how people use their software, sending emails, using word processing, making presentations, if you're in my job, for example. And when you pull that data, it seems that over the last couple of years, working hours have increased by 13%. What's more, even though we're working longer than ever, 64% of people still don't feel like they've got enough time to get their work done. Well, I've got some good news for you today. It doesn't have to be this way. You know, over the last 20 years, I've had the privilege to work with some of the world's top performers in sports ranging from road cycling to alpine skiing to motorsport, including in Formula One. However, the focus of my work and research is on the workplace. And my real passion is providing people with science-based strategies that reveal a future where well-being fuels business success. Now, I am a scientist, but this is more than just theory. There was a fantastic study done just last year where a group of researchers looked at something called the Highest Wellbeing Places to Work Index. And they took the 100 companies that are in that index and constructed a hypothetical basket of those stocks. And they found that if you compared the performance of those top 100 wellbeing companies against the S&P 500, it outperformed the S&P 500 by 20 percentage points. Now, I haven't been always quite so fascinated by the S&P 500. In fact, about 20 years ago, I moved to the south of France and tried to pursue my dream of becoming a professional cyclist. Back then, that was the only pathway. We didn't have things like the Olympic Development Programme. If you wanted to try and make it as a professional road cyclist, you packed your bags, which I did at the age of 19, and moved to the continent. It was an incredible experience. You can see in this photo, this is actually from the Pyrenees, near to where I was based at the time. And I was so committed to realising my dream, to exploring my potential. But I was convinced that the secret to me reaching my potential was simply putting in more effort. My belief was based on putting in more effort in the hope that that might help me to get better results. Unfortunately, I got a pretty rude awakening because I found that more effort rather than leading to better results ended up with me experiencing a pretty bad case of overtraining. That overtraining probably was related to under-recovering, and as a consequence of that, my performance was really impaired. Now, fortunately, I'm quite a curious guy. I had a bit of a scientific background, so I ended up being a very early adopter of different scientific training methods, of wearable devices and technologies. Any cyclists in the room here might be familiar with things like power meters and heart rate monitors, to try to understand how I could make the most of my potential in a way that wouldn't compromise my health in the process. I learnt an incredibly important lesson during this time. The first was that rather than just throwing my effort around and trying to work harder in a mindless way, I needed to try and characterize my training and build it around deliberate effort. Deliberate effort in this case meant not leaving my training and its structure to chance. It meant having a clear structure for the intensity and the duration of my training. Secondly, perhaps most importantly, I needed to combine that deliberate effort with proactive recovery. Now, often when we think about recovery, we think about just stopping work, right? We think about reducing demands. But proactive recovery is slightly different. This is about actually doing things proactively which restore us, that help to replenish us. And I realized that if I was able to combine that deliberate effort with that proactive recovery, that formed the basis for achieving sustainable high performance. And in my case, this meant that I got some results. I started to experience more of my potential, and perhaps most importantly, I didn't compromise my health in the process. Now, unfortunately, my cycling career didn't quite reach the heights that I hoped. If I was honest with myself, I was probably more of a scientist than I was a cyclist. So I went back to the UK, I enrolled in university again, I studied a subject called sport and exercise science, and then, like many failed athletes, I set up my own coaching business. Now, many of the people that I worked with during this time were amateurs. I had a few clients who were professionals, who were elite riders, but the bread and the butter, the foundation of my coaching business, was a very unusual bunch of people. I was based in London at the time. These people were management consultants, finance professionals, technology workers, and for some reason, in addition to working for 80 hours a week, they decided to go and ride their bikes for 180 kilometers at the weekend. So I became a performance coach to these knowledge workers. And I started to realize that unless I could somehow account for the load associated with their working life, I couldn't plan their physical training effectively. And in the end, I began to conceptualize the work that they did from Monday to Friday, 80 hours a week, as a cognitive activity, as a kind of cognitive performance. And I began to see that these people were a kind of blend of a cognitive and physical athlete. However, there was so much that I needed to learn to understand about this world. I needed to be able to measure and understand what was going on in knowledge work. So I started to combine tools and frameworks from my training as a sports scientist, but also tools from physiology and neuroscience to try and understand what was going on. And this led me to a question that continues to fascinate me. What on earth is going on in knowledge workers' brains? Well, before we explore that question, I've got a question for you. Have you ever said to yourself, I feel like my brain is going at 1,000,000 miles an hour? Sound familiar? I think many of us can relate to that. Well, I'm going to disappear off stage again because I've got a device here that can actually measure what is going on in our brain. So this, if you could peer in and see, it's called an EEG headset. Basically, it can measure the electrical activity of your brain. There's 14 channels in this headset. If I turn it on, and try and fit it to my head and position it and mess up my hair, then I should be able to acquire a signal. There's these saline-soaked pads, 14 of them, and it's picking up on the electrical activity of my scalp. And the amazing thing is that electrical activity can be broken down into brainwave frequencies, which if I switch this software over, and if it works okay, we should be able to see. There we go. So each of these lines represents a channel from this EEG headset, patterns of the electrical activity in my brain. And we can convert that data into brainwave frequency bands from slow to fast. So if I switch screens, you can see some slow waves, some theta waves, going into slightly faster alpha waves. And then we've got this very important beta brainwave band, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a moment. We've got low beta, high beta, and then you can see a few gamma waves popping up as well. It's interesting to see how it kind of spikes and changes when I kind of turn and look at it and pay a bit of attention. But this is all very interesting from a scientific point of view. I'm kind of measuring the speed of my brain. But I'm going to show you something else in a minute, more of a kind of artistic representation that can be quite informative. Before I do that, though, I just want to give you a quick kind of 101 on brainwave frequencies. So the slowest waves that we often see are in this delta brainwave frequency band. Hopefully you won't see any of these today. This is associated with deep sleep. Hopefully you won't see any deep sleepers in the audience either. Maybe I should have put some headsets on all of you and we could keep everyone honest. But we're going to move from the delta waves into slightly faster theta waves. We see theta waves associated with relaxation, with meditation, with creativity. Faster still, and if you notice these colours are starting to get a bit warmer, that'll be important in a moment. We've got alpha waves. We see alpha waves when we're in a calm state, maybe if you're taking a break, for example. Then faster still, warmer still, we've got beta waves. This is the kind of dominant brainwave frequency for our normal waking state. But if you remember back to that previous screen, those beta brainwave frequencies are kind of split into two bands. Low beta, when we're kind of calm and engaged. High beta, when we're actually starting to get stressed. And then we've got gamma waves. We probably won't see too many of those, but warmer still, we see this associated with higher order mental activities. Now, I'm going to switch to another piece of software now, and you'll be able to see my brain activity in real time. But these brainwave frequencies are going to be represented as different colors, cool to warm. Okay. So here you can see a representation of my brain activity, and a whole cascade of these quite cool kind of alpha into beta waves. What happens if I try and make myself a little bit stressed? Yeah, you can start to see some of this kind of red, the high beta. You know, if I maybe try and think about something that makes me laugh, you might see a bigger cascade of activity. But a lot of the activity is focused around the front part of my brain, the prefrontal cortex. You can think about this as the control center of the brain, a part of the brain that I'm particularly interested in. Because as knowledge workers, that's part of our brain which is responsible for so many of the tasks that we engage in during the average day. And the amazing thing is that we can use this technology to measure what is going on during the workday and understand how to structure the workday in a way that will support both well-being and performance. So those factors, rather than being in conflict with each other, start to be complementary. There's some really interesting research into this, and in addition to kind of measuring and representing it in this artistic way, we can also record brain activity continually and understand, for example, when people are paying attention. So you can see now another representation of my brain activity, attention at the top. So you'll notice a kind of spike over to the right-hand side, which was associated with this demonstration starting. There's a bit of a delay in this representation. You'll also notice a bit of a peak of stress. So you see this purple line. It says ST right down at the bottom. Look at that spike there, about 110. When I started this demonstration, I was panicking about whether this headset was actually going to work and connect, and thankfully it did. Otherwise, maybe you'd see smoke coming out of it or something. But my point being, we can actually use technology like this to get an insight into the day to support both well-being and performance. And honestly, I think many of us would probably agree, we need it, right? Well-being is a challenge. Again, we can pull data from software and we can see that overlapping invitations, meeting invitations, have increased by about 46%. The net result of this is that we're doing more back-to-back meetings, and as a result of that, we're taking fewer breaks. Now, I'm going to share some research from someone else who's also used one of these EEG headsets. I'm just going to put this out of the way for a moment, and we can see what has actually been going on when we don't take breaks between meetings. So this is another piece of data, it's another representation of brain activity during the day where knowledge workers didn't take a break between meetings. And so what you see when people don't take a break is this higher beta brainwave activity. And if you remember from just a few slides ago, that's associated with higher negative stress, even with anxiety. But we also see that when people don't take a break between meetings, there's a phenomenon called negative frontal alpha asymmetry. I'm going to test you on this at the end. But essentially, this indicates lower engagement in the meetings. So the simple story from this quite complex piece of research is that when we don't take breaks between meetings, we see reduced well-being, but also worse performance. But as I started to explore this question, what is going on in a knowledge worker's brain, this led me to a second question. What is performance in knowledge work anyway? It's quite a challenge because the problem with knowledge work is that there's often no single correct answer. There's no one way to complete the task that we're engaged in. And it can be quite difficult to measure the outcomes. What is productivity in knowledge work? Fortunately, some great researchers have explored this question for me. There was a study done a few years ago in almost 190,000 people in over 80 companies around the world. And they described how 4 key capabilities are critical for performance in knowledge work. The first group of capabilities relates to what we describe as diverse insights. This means identifying trends and seeking different perspectives. Secondly, productive efficiency. This is about working efficiently and productively to achieve results. Thirdly, problem solving. Pretty self-explanatory, solving problems effectively. Fourthly, emotional intelligence. This means being a leader who creates supportive and emotionally intelligent environments to work in. It relates to our social intelligence, our ability to relate effectively with each other. I'd also add a couple of other capabilities onto this. Other complementary research has highlighted the importance of analytical judgment. This relates to precision in evaluation and decision making, and also creative thinking. And in this case, I'd define it as innovating beyond conventional boundaries. But if we just zoom in on those first 4 capabilities for a moment, the researchers concluded after looking at these 190,000 people that 89% of the difference in performance between strong and weak organizations in terms of their leadership effectiveness was explained by those first 4 capabilities. Unfortunately, when I started to measure performance in knowledge work through this lens, I observed a very familiar dysfunctional pattern, one that I'd seen 20 years earlier when I was a cyclist. It was a pattern that was characterized by overwork, under-recovering, and those capabilities were fundamentally compromised. This particular chart shows a data set that I gathered in some of the highest performing companies around the world. And in this particular study, I was measuring the relationship between their average sleep as a population and their cognitive performance. Now, you can see the blue bars represent sleep, the grey line represents cognitive performance. And when I processed this data and started to visualize it, one thing really leapt out to me. Consistently across this group, the lowest cognitive performance followed the shortest night of sleep. Now, it's not just me who's observed this relationship. There's many studies that describe it. But did you know that working long days, so that means working more than 55 hours per week, increases the risk of disrupted sleep by more than 200%. And again, when we don't sleep enough, those fundamental cognitive capabilities that explain so much of the difference in performance between strong and weak organizations start to get impaired. For example, when we don't sleep enough, problem-solving ability decreases by around 60%. There was another really interesting study where they looked at how much sleep debt leaders had. And they found that when leaders carried higher sleep debt, that was associated with worse psychological safety among their teams. And that was likely related to the leaders not being as emotionally intelligent, perhaps snapping at people. I'm sure that many of us can relate to this. Sometimes, we manage to hold it together during the workday, but when we've not slept enough, it's often the people closest to us who get the worst of us. Not sleeping enough also has an impact on our IQ. There was a really influential piece of research that found that if we were to sleep for 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, cognitive performance declined, equivalent to going about 2 nights without sleep. And you could represent that as a drop in performance equivalent to 15 IQ points. The interesting thing about this piece of research, though, was that they also measured how sleepy and impaired people felt. And quite curiously, even though people's cognitive performance had dropped equivalent to dropping 15 IQ points, people's perception was that they weren't that much more sleepy or impaired than if they'd slept for 8 hours per night. See, unfortunately, we're quite poor judges of how inadequate sleep affects us. And as a result of that, for many of us, kind of impaired performance has become a kind of new normal. As a result, for leaders, I think this is a particular challenge. Sometimes I describe something called the leadership paradox, and essentially it describes how leadership demands can impair a leader's ability to lead. Those high demands, those long working hours, which are often part of the job, end up compromising those fundamental capabilities that explain so much of the difference between strong and weak leadership. So, what is the solution? Well, I'm convinced from my work and research over nearly 2 decades now that we need to approach knowledge work, that's work where we think for a living, as a cognitive endurance activity. In practice, this means that we can apply some very similar principles that I used to apply in the context of athletic performance to endurance athletes in the context of knowledge work. It begins with deliberate effort. This means not leaving how we deploy effort to chance. It means having a clear structure for intensity and duration. Secondly, again, perhaps most importantly, we need proactive recovery. It's about so much more than just removing demands. It's about intentional rest and restoring energy. And I've seen consistently that if you combine deliberate effort with proactive recovery, it forms the basis for sustainable high performance. And in this case, it means that we can improve well-being as well as support business success. But now I've shared all this data with you, I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that proactive recovery has to start with adequate quality sleep. And the bad news is, I'm afraid, for the vast majority of people, unless you've got a very rare genetic mutation on the DEC2 gene, that means we've got to sleep for 7 hours per night. But it's not just about sleep, right? We also need a framework to help us to work smarter. And in practice, I like to conceptualize this as upgrading our mental operating system. Now, how many people here are kind of endurance athletes or have done some kind of running or swimming or cycling and used a heart rate monitor? See by a kind of show of hands. Yeah, we've got a few people here. Well, you might be familiar with this notion of training zones or intensity zones, and you measure your heart rate and you plan your training according to those zones. And so I basically used that principle and created a metaphorical framework, a kind of heuristic, to describe intensities of knowledge work, intensities of cognitive work, and I described that framework as cognitive gears. I'd like you to imagine for a moment, there is a high intensity cognitive gear, a high gear, which is characterized by deliberate effort in efficient, impactful, priority-driven work. How much of your average day do you spend in that gear? Well, next, I'd like you to imagine that there's a middle cognitive gear. This is characterized, rather than being about focus and productivity and efficiency, it's frequent task switching. It's the time that we spend in meetings and doing emails, for example. And finally, there is a low cognitive gear that represents the time that we spend in proactive recovery, actively doing some things that restore our energy, that replenishes. But if you were to just reflect for a moment, where do you spend most of your time? You know, the vast majority of knowledge workers that I've worked with, that I've measured over the years, spend way too much of their time stuck in a cognitive middle gear, a middle gear that's characterized by frequent task switching, by meetings, by emails, and very little time either in proactive recovery or that real deliberate high gear focus. I think many of us will probably relate to the feeling that there is kind of a battle for our attention. You know, there's more competition for our attention than perhaps ever before. There's a great researcher called Gloria Mark, and she's been measuring people's attention span for nearly 2 decades now. And she's observed a really concerning trend. About 20 years ago, the average attention span was about 2.5 minutes. That's about the amount of time that it took when someone was working on a screen before they switched to another screen or another application, for example. 20 years later, the average attention span has dropped to just 47 seconds. You know, I often reflect on this quote. We have a wealth of information, but a poverty of attention. You know, all too often, I feel like we treat our attention like loose change. We're kind of throwing it around. But my message to you this evening is we need to stop doing that. We need to shift away from throwing our attention around like it's loose change, you know, lost down the back of a sofa, and instead start treating it like a precious resource that we need to invest wisely. You know, this is the basis of working smarter. It's about finding time to spend in this high cognitive gear, increasing the quality of our focused effort, where it's going to have the greatest impact. Secondly, we're never going to get rid of that middle gear, but I'm convinced that we can find ways to reduce the amount of time spent in it. And in the second part of this presentation, I'm going to give you some really practical tools to do that, ways to reduce the inefficiency that compromises productivity. And finally, some of us need to relearn how to recover, to actually integrate some of this proactive rest into our workday. I've seen the evidence, this is more than just theory, that if we apply this framework, it's going to support those fundamental cognitive capabilities that differentiate the highest performing leaders. And it's very likely it's going to support our well-being too. This process might begin with quite a simple step. You need to identify your chronotype. Now, chronotype sounds like quite a complex term, but we can start to discover it with quite a simple question. When do you feel at your best? So if I was to ask this group now, by a show of hands, how many people here feel at their best in the morning? They would call themselves early birds. Yeah, so we've got kind of a fair number of people here. How many people here are night owls? Yeah, we've got a few night owls. How many people here would say they're kind of somewhere in between? Yeah, somewhere in the middle, a few. Well, we've all got this natural tendency towards morningness, eveningness, or being somewhere in between, which we describe as chronotype. But regardless of that tendency, cognitive performance does vary for most of us by about 20% during the average day. Now, the people who put their hand up and said they're early birds, you'll likely experience this variation as a peak, followed by a valley, and then a rebound. The night owls experience this variation in reverse. You start the day with a rebound, then you have a valley in the middle of the day. Your peak period comes later in the day, likely into the evening. But regardless of that tendency to morningness or eveningness, or the order in which you experience those different elements, this variation makes some parts of the day better suited to certain types of work. The principle of adapting our work to suit our chronotype is sometimes called chrono-working, and the application of it is actually quite simple. In practice, this would be about paying attention to when you feel at your best. And if you could, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, try to schedule some of that high cognitive gear time with that point of the day that you feel at your best. Secondly, in that rebound where your energy is naturally lower, could you use that time to take an effective break? And finally, in that middle gear period, the point where you start to rebound, when the valley is over, where your energy is coming back again after you've taken that kind of break, that proactive rest, could you use that time where you're a bit distracted anyway, where you're not in peak performance, for those meetings, for those switching tasks, the stuff that just needs to get done? So rather than letting that middle gear kind of spread over the whole day, drive up your stress and reduce your productivity, consider if maybe just 1 day per week you could take that more structured approach, combining deliberate effort with proactive rest. Unfortunately, it seems that very few people experience their workday in this way. Nearly 70% of people say that they don't have enough uninterrupted focus time during their workday. So what can we do? Well, we might find the answer in quite a curious location, in the kitchen of a young Italian called Francesco Cirillo in the 1980s. Young Francesco was studying for his university exams, and he was sitting at the kitchen table in his mother's home, and he had about 4 hours stretching ahead of him that he knew he needed to get his head into the books. And to be honest, he felt overwhelmed. He needed to find a way to maintain his focus and attention for that 4-hour period. So he had the bright idea. He thought, what if instead of trying to concentrate for 4 hours continually, instead I'll find a way to break this 4-hour period down into little chunks. I'll focus as much as I can, and then I'll take a break, and then I'll focus again. But he realized that in order to do this, he needed some kind of timer. So he was looking around his mother's kitchen, and the kitchen, as I mentioned, was in Italy, and he found this cooking timer, which was very popular in Italy at the time. It just so happened this timer was shaped like a tomato. And he used this tomato timer to break down this 4-hour period into 25-minute blocks of focus with 5 minutes of recovery. And I can see a few light bulbs going on now, because any Italian speakers here will likely know that the Italian word for tomato is pomodoro. And the technique which Francesco pioneered in his mother's kitchen back in the 1980s has now been popularized all over the world, and it's commonly described as the Pomodoro technique. Breaking your day down into deliberate periods of focus, generally 25 minutes, because that happened to be convenient on the kitchen timer that he used, followed by 5 minutes of rest. I encourage you to try it if you've never tried it before. You might not need a tomato timer, you could just use your smartphone. But the evidence is really compelling that we could gain across industries nearly $500 billion by optimizing knowledge workers' time with dedicated periods of focus. The next step, though, is we've somehow got to free up some time for this high gear work. And this leads me to talk about the cognitive middle gear. How can we reduce the inefficiency that compromises so much of our productivity? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I'm a pretty keen cyclist, and the bicycle is an incredible piece of engineering. Did you know that it's actually the most efficient form of human transportation? If we look at efficiency in terms of how much energy it takes to move a given distance, the bicycle is about 5 times more efficient than walking, for example. Now, you probably may also have heard that Steve Jobs used the bicycle as a metaphor, and he famously described the computer as a bicycle for the mind, based on the fact that it could improve our efficiency by orders of magnitude relative to using pen and paper and word processors, for example. Now, who am I to disagree with Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple? I certainly don't disagree with him. I do think that the computer can be the bicycle for the mind. It's an incredible tool for efficiency. But I think the real problem is that if the computer is the bicycle for the mind. Many of us have forgotten how to use the brakes. And as a result of that, our days are out of control. According to some research, 70% of emails are opened within 6 seconds of receiving them. 42% of people admit to using email in the bathroom. I'm sure that nobody here has done that. Once we get back from the bathroom, back to work, according to some data, we're interrupted once every 11 minutes. But that's not the worst part of the story. Once we've been interrupted, it then takes about 23 minutes to get back up to speed on the original task. Now, as a result of that constant interruption and the time it takes to get back up to speed, the cost of that is often lower productivity and higher stress. For example, we see consistently that the more time we spend on email, the worse people perform and the more anxious they feel. So how on earth can we tackle this problem? Well, recently, a group of researchers looked at the 25 years of evidence that we now have about email use, and they described 5 email super actions that can help us to stem the tide of this email overload. The first step is to reconsider. I encourage you to rethink your promises to respond rapidly. Very often as knowledge workers, we get caught up in this false sense of urgency. And this first step is perhaps the most important. Secondly, clarify. This means setting expectations about when you'll respond with email signatures. It could be as simple as saying, I'll endeavour to respond to you within 24 hours or 48. You can even set different email signatures for internal versus external emails, for example. The third step is to schedule. Rather than using email as much as possible, spreading it over the whole day, could you experiment by batching email use to specific parts of the day? Fourthly, limit. Switch off your notifications. Similarly, maybe do an experiment. Check your email once every hour versus whenever that phone vibrates or maybe something pops up on your smartwatch. And finally, hide. If you're working on a task that doesn't require you to use your smartphone, could you put it away? There was a really interesting piece of research published a couple of years ago, and they found that if you were to leave your smartphone in another room, it could boost cognitive performance on a task by 10%. If we were able to put some of these ideas into action, evidence indicates it could save us about 180 hours per year. Perhaps freeing a bit of time to invest in that high cognitive gear work, but maybe in some proactive rest too. But it's not just email that's causing us problems, right? Again, if we pull data from the office software that many of us typically use, it seems that the number of weekly meetings over the last couple of years has increased by 153%. Now, many people say that they would love to decline most of the meetings that they receive invites for. In fact, when you ask people, they say they'd like to decline about 1/3 of the meetings that end up in their inbox. Unfortunately, though, people only decline about half of that number. And when you ask people why, it's not because they think the meetings are worth missing, it's just because organizational norms make them compelled to attend those meetings. There's an expectation that they turn up. Now, I'm convinced that we need to rethink these norms, and particularly when it comes to meetings, we need to refocus on quality over quantity. Again, I like a good study by now. I like a bit of research, and some great researchers have done some studies to describe some practical ways that we can streamline our meeting calendar. Again, there's several steps that we can follow to do this. It begins by assessing. Do a bit of an audit of your calendar. Take a step back and identify low-value recurring meetings. They're standing meetings which are just there because, not necessarily because there's a clear objective or something you need to achieve. They're there because they've always been there. Can you get rid of them? That's the next step. Once you've identified those low-value recurring meetings, delete them from your calendar. A good signal sometimes that there's a recurring meeting that could be deleted is if it's a standing meeting with fewer than 5 attendees. Because if there are fewer than 5 people, you can probably just afford to set a meeting when you need it, when there's something that really needs to be discussed. There's agility there with fewer than 5 people, rather than just have it always in your calendar. Thirdly, reduce. Humour me and do an experiment. Have a look at what happens if you move your standing meetings which are left that are fortnightly to monthly, and maybe the weekly to fortnightly. You'll rapidly reduce the number of meetings that you have, and when organisations try this, they generally find that it doesn't affect productivity at all. And finally, shorten. Again, do an experiment. Could you take any standing meetings that you have, or perhaps even any meeting that you set, and by default reduce it from 60 minutes to 30 or 30 minutes to 15? You don't need to do this forever, but organizations that try this generally find that it has a profoundly positive effect. For example, 76 companies did an experiment. They found ways to reduce the number of meetings that they did by about 20%. And as a result of that, both their performance improved and their stress dropped. There's another step to take as well, though, and this is to identify what I describe as meeting makers. I'm sure that many of you know a few meeting makers. There might even be some of them in this room among us right now. But when you look at the data about meetings, it seems that just 5% of employees are responsible for setting 60% of meetings. These meeting makers set off an avalanche of activity that cascades down the organizational mountain, swamping the rest of us, often in unnecessary work. So, if you know a meeting maker, get them to ask these 4 questions before they set a meeting. Number 1, have they thought through this situation on their own? If the answer is no, rather than scheduling a meeting, they need to schedule some time for their own strategic thinking. Number 2, ask yourself, do you need outside input to make progress? Encourage the meeting makers in particular to ask that question. Again, if the answer is no, they need to schedule time to do their own work before they try and dump it on you. Thirdly, ask yourself and get the meeting makers to ask themselves, does moving forward require a real-time conversation? Again, if the answer is no, perhaps you could send an email. I don't know about you, but I have lost count of the number of meetings that I've been part of that could have been replaced with a single, well-worded email. Fourthly, does it really necessitate a face-to-face meeting? If not, perhaps a Zoom, perhaps some kind of real-time chat could suffice. Finally, if they've answered those 4 questions and the answer is yes to everyone, then it's time to schedule the meeting, but perhaps most importantly, prepare for it. Set an agenda. Have a clear idea about what you're trying to achieve. As I mentioned just a moment ago, I think the evidence for this is really compelling. There was a case study published in HBR a while ago that looked at those 76 companies, and when they reduced their meetings by applying some of these strategies by 20%, stress dropped by 26% and productivity leaped by 35%. As we start to come into land today, I'd like to finish by talking about this low cognitive gear. How can we learn to recover proactively? I've got a question for you. When was the last time that you scheduled time to switch off? If you were to ask a group of the average knowledge worker, it seems that half of knowledge workers, rarely or never take breaks during the workday. It's absolutely clear that our brain needs a break. Those same researchers that I shared some data from earlier who use those EEG headsets, they looked at that same group of knowledge workers on a day that they took breaks between meetings rather than having back-to-back meetings. And they observed a really interesting pattern. They found that when people took breaks between meetings, they started to see a shift in the electrical activity of their brains from that high beta brainwave band to low beta, which indicates lower stress and improved well-being. Secondly, when people took breaks between meetings, instead of seeing negative frontal alpha asymmetry, they saw positive frontal alpha asymmetry, which indicates higher engagement, enhanced performance. So the message from this research is really quite simple. Effective breaks between meetings will enhance both your well-being and performance. Well-being and performance can be complementary rather than being in conflict. But if we do have these breaks between meetings, how do we design an effective micro break? Well, it seems that if we were to synthesize all of the research, the most effective micro breaks have 4 characteristics. They are relaxing, social, active, and natural. And I'm going to share some practical ideas with you from each of these 4 categories. How do you make your breaks relaxing? Well, in line with that notion of proactive recovery, this means that our breaks are more than about just stopping work. Sometimes we actually need to do something. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do something kind of, pious and virtuous, like meditate or do some kind of controlled breathing or yoga, even though I think those things are great. There was an interesting piece of research published that suggests that watching a funny video, watching a humorous video on your smartphone during a break improved subsequent task performance by about 12%. Sometimes we just need to do something to break state, something that is about more than just removing job demands. Secondly, the most effective breaks are social. In practice, this means interacting with someone, ideally someone that we find supportive, that we've got a positive relationship with. Researchers found that when people interact with someone that they feel is supportive, it made subsequent challenges feel easier by about 30%. Now, interestingly, the researchers compared the effect of people who interacted in person versus people who interacted virtually, and they found that both were equally beneficial. So in practice, if you get the chance to take a micro break, perhaps you could go for a walk with a colleague or friend, maybe pick up the phone and send a text message to a loved one. Interestingly, the researchers found that even just bringing to mind a supportive person was effective. Thirdly, the most effective breaks are active. Now, it's incredible that over 80% of our brain's grey matter is modifiable by physical activity. And research indicates that even 10 minutes of light exercise can boost emotional resilience, improve mood, and enhance cognition. Finally, the most effective breaks are natural. Now, ideally, we get outside. There's something called attention restoration theory that describes the uniquely restorative benefits of spending time in nature. It seems to relate to how brain activity shifts when we expose ourselves to natural fractal patterns, so leaves on trees, clouds in the sky. But whatever the case, if you were to take one of those relaxing, active, social, natural breaks, try and look up at the trees, at the sky, at the clouds. You might be surprised at the benefits. Even looking at a digital representation of nature seems to be effective. The results of the study that you can see on this slide suggest that 90 seconds of looking at a forest scene on a large screen was associated with significant improvements in sensations of comfort and relaxation. When I speak with many high performers, people sometimes push back and they say, is this really feasible? And I'm often reminded of a conversation I had with a guy called Alex Stubb a few years ago, a guy who I was interviewing for a book I was writing at the time. Alex is the former Foreign Secretary, Prime Minister, and current President of Finland. And you might be aware that Finland is consistently rated as one of the happiest places to live in the world. And Alex described the basis for him performing at such a high level in his work. And we had a really wide-ranging conversation. One of the things that stood out most to me was that when he joined the call, and I fully anticipated it would be from some well-appointed office in the Parliament building, which you can see on the slide here, we actually did the interview while he was riding his exercise bike. But three things really stood out to me from the conversation. The first was that he really prioritized exercise during his day. So much so that one of the first things he did when he took office was to renovate the gym in the ministry that he was working in. And he took active breaks, but he encouraged other people to take active breaks too. Secondly, he prioritized sleep. But not just sleep. When he couldn't sleep enough, he also integrated power naps into his day. The evidence indicates that just a 10-minute power nap can significantly improve mood and cognitive performance. Finally, he was super proactive about putting these things in his calendar. He scheduled time off, not just the meetings during his day. In the average organization, 22% of people exhibit burnout symptoms. That drops to just 2% when people adopt proactive recovery strategies. What's more, performance is boosted by 26%. Sometimes our most important work doesn't look like work at all. It starts with high cognitive gear, scheduling time to focus on our top priority tasks. It then involves time spent in low cognitive gear, taking relaxing, social, active, natural breaks, and then spending time in this middle cognitive gear, streamlining meetings, reducing distractions. In the future of work, it's estimated that some of these generative AI tools might reduce our working hours by 30%. Unsurprisingly, 49% of people worry that AI might replace them. Yet, 70% of people still would like to delegate as much work as possible. My question to you today is this: if this future really evolves as we anticipate it might, could we invest some of that extra time in periods of deliberate focus, proactive rest, and adequate sleep? I'm convinced that if we do, we might form the basis for something that I describe as regenerative performance, a self-perpetuating cycle of human thriving and sustainable high performance that enhances business performance. Again, this is more than just a theory. Organisations investing in people and performance rather than one or the other achieve 30% higher revenue growth. Complementary evidence suggests that just a 1-point increase in organisational well-being, that's on a 1 to 5 scale, is associated with an increase in profit of between $2 to $3 billion. It often feels like well-being and performance are in conflict, but they are not. I'm convinced, I hope that you're convinced too, that in the future of work, it's going to be well-being that fuels business success. Thank you. Thanks.